And good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, everybody. And for at least one of our panelists, good late evening or very early morning for everybody. My name is Peter Greenberg. I'm the travel editor for CBS News and happy to be a part of the 23rd Annual World Tourism Awards. Normally at this time of the year, I would be in London, as would all of our panelists, for the actual event itself at the World Travel Mart. We're doing this virtually today, and we're doing it a little bit differently today. But first, I want to make some thank yous, of course, to the Bradford Group and Karen Hoffman for putting this together, as she does every year in an unbelievable way against usually pretty big odds. And of course, we want to thank our sponsors who've been with us all along, the New York Times, the Travel Corporation, United Airlines, and of course, Reed Exhibitions, which makes the WTM possible and is allowing us this space during the session. What we're going to do differently this year is we're not going to give out an award, we're going to revisit award winners, basically to give us the proper context, the proper perspective of what's been going on in their world, specifically in terms of sustainability, the environment, and perhaps putting together a blueprint to how we move forward in the age of COVID-19. Let me introduce them to you. We have Fiona Jeffrey, the founder of Just a Drop, Matthew Upchurch, of course, the CEO of Virtuoso, James Thornton, the CEO of Intrepid Travel, Brett Tolman, who is the CEO of the Travel Corporation. And did I miss anybody at all? I don't think I did. Okay, so let's get. Okay, good. Let me start with this. 9 months ago, what was topic A? Over tourism, a pilot shortage as airlines were experiencing rapid growth around the world. And of course, new destinations that were opening up. We were at the verge of 1.4 billion people about to cross a border. And that's where we were at the beginning of this year. And then suddenly, in almost a 2-week period, it essentially not only evaporated, it took a giant step backwards. And one of the things that was the most challenging to many of you, I would suspect, were your own mission statements, because you were so much involved in what we would call, for lack of a better term, sustainable tourism. So what I'd like to ask each of you to do, and I'll go around the room here, and then of course, we're happy to take questions from our audience, all of whom are watching virtually as well, is what were you working on before that was challenged? How are you able to adapt to it? How are you able to respond to it? And how do we move forward at a time when it's not just a matter of sustainable tourism in and of itself, but the economic challenges that COVID-19 has wrought? So Matthew, let me start with you. Matthew Upchurch, the CEO of Virtuoso.
Thank you, Peter. And that's a really good question, because I think that, as we started really focusing on sustainability over a decade ago and really extending that with Jessica's work, the one thing that we realize is that when you talk about sustainability, a lot of times people only think about the environment. And yet we have 3 pillars for sustainability, which were obviously the environment, taking care of the planet, the preservation of natural cultural heritage, but also the benefit to local economies. So the reality is that as we pivoted from the challenges of over tourism to the disaster of under tourism, because of what it's affecting communities all over the world and the economic impact, which directly correlate to the economics that are there to preserve, the environment, so many reserves, so many areas. So for us, it's really been a matter of pivoting to that particular story. We have a tremendous amount of data from our customers and from the research that we had done, that there had been a growing importance with regards to a concept we call the commoditization of quality, which meant that particularly in the affluent sector, that as overall levels of quality kept rising, more and more customers around the world were telling us that they were going to make decisions about who they were going to support based on something other than the expected quality they were receiving, which was, of course, a set of values. So I think that for us right now, we're really trying to put a face on this under tourism disaster, because whether it's poaching in Africa, whether it's other the economic disaster in places all over the world where tourism is such a protector, and then really putting a real face, because when we talk about 197 million travel industry direct and indirect jobs being evaporated in this year, we need to put a face to that. And that's where we've been focusing. So for us, it's really trying to put a face on what this under-tourism disaster is all about.
I mean, so much of this is connectivity that most people don't see. So for example, in Africa, it's not a question that the airlines aren't flying there. It's not just that alone. It's travelers aren't going there. There's no money being fed into the economy. It's not just that people can't put food on the table. There's not enough money to support the rangers to protect the animals. I mean, it just continues to go in this vicious cycle.
Right. Yeah. And I remember one of the most impactful things I heard many, many years ago in 2009 during the GFC was, Costas, who basically said that if there was a magical switch on the wall, and this was in 2009, if there was a magical switch on the wall when everybody was chaining themselves at Heathrow saying, don't fly, he said, well, what if we actually got what if we wanted that radical situation? What if you hit that switch and tourism stopped? And the thesis was it could end up being one of the worst environmental disasters in the history of the planet. And so that actually, unfortunately, is what we're looking at. So I think that as we're looking at now, we're looking at a conscious comeback. We need to focus on what the effects are to all of the communities around the world. And then how do we come back? How do we make sure that in this forced shutdown, that when we come back in a way that isn't driven by the desperation of making up for lost time, and hopefully we can come back with a better framework. And I know, for example, we talk about Africa a lot, but I was talking to a friend of ours and someone who's in our network in Florence, and you think about how the municipality of Florence is talking about, how do we want to come back? Do we really want to go back to exactly the way it was? And I think some of those questions are very, very impactful and very important in where we're going forward.
Well, remember this, Matthew, we were talking 9 months ago about Barcelona didn't want to become another Venice, and Venice didn't want to become another Barcelona. At one point, they were actually toying with the idea of putting turnstiles on St. Mark's Square and banning all cruise ships. So in a way, what you're saying, and I'll throw this open to the other panelists, is not because we planned it this way, but we're being given an opportunity for a reset.
Correct. And also, I think what's important is that's why it was always important to not, when we talk about sustainability, it wasn't just the environment, because if we don't align what's good for people with what's good for the planet, right? If we don't align those things together. So making sure that a sustainable agenda also makes sure that it's good for the communities and for employment. I mean, we are the largest service, industry in the world. And we're finding out that there will not be a full economic recovery without the recovery of travel and tourism.
Fiona, when you and I have spoken before, and in many of your presentations, you always surprise me because you were able to put what normally would just be like a presentation with facts and figures into some real terms based on the name of your organization, right? It's the water, right? It's sort of like James Carville during the last election. It's the economy, stupid. With you, it's the water, stupid. And what happened during the COVID-19 crisis, where your mission gets affected, and not to mention your educational outreach. How are you educating governments? How are you educating business that this is not just as important, but maybe even more important as we move forward?
Well, again, very good question, Peter. And the irony is with us, when everything else is tumbling around, actually what we do became even more critical. The thing that was being asked of people was to wash their hands. And when you are dealing with communities across the world that don't actually have easy access to water to be able to do that, your role becomes even more imperative. And so we moved into an immediate COVID-19 response program, recognizing that we're working in developing countries. So, some of the concerns that existed in the developed world in terms of the sustainability of their healthcare systems and whether the NHS was going to continue and the pressure being put on those. Well, we were dealing with health centers that didn't have access to running water. that we had already put those facilities in, but suddenly we find that we need to put in more hand washing facilities. We need to up our programs in terms of soap making. The whole impact on livelihoods has been huge because these governments have shut down very, very quickly compared to the Western developed world. So suddenly public transport systems aren't available. So people have to walk longer distances if they want to get to work. They might not end up having jobs because there's no furlough system to support that. So, and then we saw that the markets were being shut. So they weren't allowed to open because they were seen as risk environments, and therefore people couldn't buy food and people couldn't trade. So again, massive impact on people's livelihoods. But again, by putting hand washing facilities into those markets, suddenly they could be reopened again on a safe basis. And the other area that was fascinating was in terms of communications, because they don't have the communication networks that we all have. So people in rural communities that, you know, are often part of the travel and tourism journey and experience, but they didn't have access to the kind of information that was required to keep them safe. So we found ourselves buying motorbikes and putting our teams on motorbikes and printing out leaflets to go out into rural communities to be able to educate and encourage people to understand how important COVID was and how to protect themselves. So I think our experience has probably been somewhat different to other travel organizations, but because we've been at it at a very grassroots level. But what's encouraging is that when you give the right support, the impact is transformational. And it doesn't take a lot to make that difference, but it does take the infrastructure and the framework, which is why working with governments and businesses is really important to actually achieve this.
You know, you talk about, you know, infrastructure. One of the things that comes to mind to me is and it goes back to what Matthew was saying about the economic power of travel and tourism, if you don't have that kind of revenue coming in and there's no connectivity, it's not long after that, with or without water, that governments can become destabilized and collapse because there's just no plan B. They don't have a treasury that can print more money to buy more water. It has to be supplied, doesn't it?
No, absolutely. But, you know, I was actually, you know, going just back to Africa for a second, I was actually really impressed I came back from Uganda the middle of February. And by the third week of February, I'd had a follow-up communication from the Minister of Health for Uganda. And in that, they were saying that anybody going into the country was going into immediate 14-day quarantine. Now, I fortunately had got out by that stage. But I shared that information with some of my travel colleagues, and some of them said to me, well, how draconian? And I ended up thinking, how can you say that? You know, and these are people that have been involved in Africa for some considerable time. And I thought, you don't understand how desperate health services and health systems and the strain that can exist. So I actually think that the African governments responded very responsibly, very quickly, much faster than those in Europe. And that has set them up well. It has put them in a much better place than they would have been.
James, who's now watching us at something like 2:13 in the morning or somewhere out there in Australia, when we talk about a shutdown or a quarantine, Australia is exactly that. You've closed. And basically, if you look at the releases that I've been reading, Australia is going to stay closed through February or March. Your airline is essentially grounded until then, with an occasional flight to nowhere for people who happen to live in Australia who cannot be denied the opportunity of just getting on a plane, even if it's going absolutely nowhere. So this impact on your operation, James, this impact on how you do business, what lessons have you learned so that they can be applied when you do reopen?
Yeah, good morning, Peter. It's great to be with you all this morning. it's we live in a very unique place down here in Australia. You know, we're a country of global migrants, yet our international borders are firmly shut. And I actually think even February and March might be optimistic. The government has taken an approach down here of severe suppression, perhaps even elimination, even though they won't confess that's the case. New Zealand has successfully, to a degree, elimination of the virus. Our borders are completely shut. We need permission from our government to leave the country. It's unthinkable when you go back 8 or 9 months ago to have our national airline come out and say, well, next year, 2021, we won't fly to the UK or the US. So clearly, as a global travel company headquartered here, we've had to pivot our operations unbelievably, as every global travel company has, and particularly the panelists on this call. So, you know, our focus down here is domestic tourism and rebuilding responsibly domestically. I'm hoping to get some Northern Hemisphere travel away. I was reflecting back 12 months ago, and I was actually with Brett at Harvard via WTTC, and Matthew's wife, Jessica, and we were really challenging ourselves as leaders of the industry. How can we ensure that some of the negative connotations that come along with travel are actually seen as the positives that can actually come from travel, that Matthew so articulately mentioned at the start of his talk? And I think, you know, if we go back, words like flight shaming, words like over tourism, I think we're getting away from some of the fantastic benefit that travel can provide and does provide. And I keep using the notion of a supermarket, that there's a notion that when you go to a supermarket, there's a health food aisle. And I think travel would become a little bit like that. There was a sustainable travel aisle or responsible travel aisle, and it gave the connotation, therefore, that the rest of the travel industry was therefore unhealthy or unsustainable or unresponsible. And I think what we want to try and use this opportunity as much as possible is that when borders do reopen down here in Australia, and that may be a long way away, or when hopefully the pandemic can get more under control in the Northern Hemisphere and we can get people moving again, that we as much as possible take some of the lessons that we had in terms of over tourism or flight shaming or the like, and try and rebuild as responsibly as we possibly can. And at Intrepid, and I know Brett's done the same at the Travel Corporation and Matthew too, we're trying to provide and share information about what we're doing as an organisation. So in Intrepid's case, we focus a lot on decarbonisation, a lot on animal welfare, and sharing guides, and they're open source guides you can access on our websites around how companies can start to take steps. Because while TTC and Virtuoso and the like have been leaders in this space, not every company has, but there's lots of good intention to do so. And so we as leaders want to try and share that information so that the entire industry can, as much as possible, start to rebuild responsibly.
Well, in the concept or on the theme of sharing that information, give me an example of some of the lessons you're now about to apply for someone who will be visiting Australia when the borders open, and how their experience is not only going to be different, but falls in line with your philosophy of sustainable travel.
Yeah, I think for Intrepid, it's not so much what we're doing differently, because it's probably just an accentuation of what we've been doing for 31 years, which is to get under this kind of a destination, to meet the local people, try the local food, stay in different types of accommodation. And, you know, at the moment, our industries down here in Australia have, like many industries around the world, been completely devastated. You know, in Melbourne, we've had one of the most severe lockdowns. We haven't been able to move more than 5 kilometres from home for 121 days. Local industry just hasn't had any form of income. And we're very lucky in Australia because we've had some reasonable government support, which has been great and helped kept a lot of travel companies supported. But small and medium enterprises are going to really struggle to get back. And so it's on Intrepid and other tourism operators to try and get as many Australians and Kiwis travelling domestically as possible, to put their money into local companies, to try the local food, have local experiences, and really start to support people in that manner.
Has that bubble ever worked right now between New Zealand and Australia? Is it working?
No. Well, there's always some sibling rivalry, that's for sure, and there's certainly not going away. But you know, you say Australia and New Zealand bubbles. I mean, down here in Australia, you can't even travel interstate at the moment, and we're spending far too much time arguing between ourselves. And I think that's where it gets so frustrating, Peter, is when it becomes politicized. And we're seeing that in our home country.
About that in the United States. We have no
absolutely.
I'm sorry.
many parts of the world. But yeah, anyway.
Brett Tolman, another award winner in the past. Brett has a nonprofit operation called Treadright. And you were obviously in existence with Treadright way before this happened. But how did you adapt the Treadright to COVID-19 in terms of, perpetuating, if you will, your mission statements on sustainable travel?
Great question, Peter. So inspired by the likes of James and Daryl at Intrepid, we started over a year ago to look at measuring our footprint and putting in place a strategy to become carbon neutral in as short a period as possible. And we're very pleased and proud to launch that strategy on World Tourism Day this past September. And that outlines how we'll align with 11 of the 17 UN's Sustainable Development Goals. It identifies 11 goals that we'll actively work on to match with those, bringing more women and girls into the workforce, reducing poverty, and so forth. And then also enhancing the experiences that we'll be offering on about 1,500 itineraries that in a typical year we would operate across our 40 brands. And those we call Make Travel Matter experiences, where we'll go to Iraq Al Amir in Amman, Jordan, for example, where there's 150 women who work in a cooperative there, started by Queen Noor in '93, and directly benefit their income and security by bringing travelers there from our brands and encouraging other companies to go there too. We've helped build out their gift shop and merchandise it effectively so that those women have a steady source of income. And that's one of 750 Make Travel Matter experiences. We do about 250 a year now that we're looking to have in place within 5 years as another part of that strategy. I would just like to note.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Brent.
I just like to note that listening to Fiona, I think we should all be extremely grateful for the lives we live when you think of those third world countries from Africa to the outback in Australia and how those people have been decimated without tourism. And I hope the world will pay more attention to the benefits and importance of travel and tourism, that we're not just a carbon contributor, but an incredible contributor to a quality of life around the world for so many people.
It's quite interesting to note in that in the United States, one of the words we use, because it's a big issue here, is people who are food insecure. Fiona gets right down to basics, water insecurity. And when you have water insecurity, it doesn't matter about anything else because you don't ever get to the next step. And
Exactly.
The question is, how does everybody work together to educate governments, to educate the private sector, and to educate local communities about the absolute need, but that all gets back to water, Fiona?
Well, there's two things I'd say. I'd say that, water is the starting point, but going back to issues like food security, when you have got water, people are healthier. You're able to put water into schools so children can get an education. You're able to provide menstrual hygiene management to encourage, going to Brett's point, girls to be able to stay in school and get an education themselves. If you've got water, you can grow crops. With crops, excess crops, you can create an income. And it's that opportunity which is touching then with the travel and tourism sector that ends up feeding into the supply chain that actually really genuinely lifts these people out of poverty. And I have a model that I keep dear to myself, and I call it the transformational triangle, Peter. And it's absolutely, it aligns with what you're saying in terms of the role of government and business and what I call the not-for-profit third sector. And I think there's a massive opportunity for the travel and tourism industry here because not all companies are like the best of the best that we see on this panel with Brett and James and Matthew and everything that their organizations and others that have that same philosophy purport and actually execute. But the industry is globally made up of lots of small, medium-sized companies. And they don't all have the financial or personnel resource to deliver the sustainability CSR programs. And we're talking a lot about social engagement now as a result of the pandemic. So they don't all have that resource. And they're also quite intimidated by the journey that they're required to go on. And one of the real opportunities I think that exists for us now is to create more collaboration between government and the business sector and the third sector, because we all become specialists and experts in delivering on the ground. And sustainability sits in our DNA in the same way as it sits in travel companies' DNA. And it's our responsibility to take that and deliver for the long term. But businesses are the impetus. They create the drive and the opportunity, but they've also got to run their own businesses. So I would like to see greater partnership and collaboration, recognition for the NGO sector that is there capable of supporting travel and tourism companies to deliver, that don't feel they can do the same job that James does or Brett does or Matthew does, but they can still take that step and add value and make a difference and enhance their own sustainability and CSR programs.
And Peter, I love the plus what Fiona said from the perspective that what I really love about what James and Brett and we're seeing more of this. It's almost this whole idea of open source, right? That in these areas of activities, being able to share out what we're doing, right? Being able to share those frameworks, working with the NGOs is really important. And I think one of the main things that we talked about at our Sustainability Under One Sky event this year is we started with a logic funnel, and it started with Wall Street. It started with the fact that we had, a story about the fact that ESG leader companies, the very large ones, are actually outperforming the sector, right? So ESG companies, and what's starting to happen is the really smart money out there, the big institutional money, the sovereign funds are starting to find out that ESG focused companies actually have lower risks, better returns, better employment engagement, better social standing, and better brands. So I think as we do that, but the other thing that I also want to say is, I also see something that's been happening lately. David Attenborough's new program is fantastic. Kiss the Ground just came out. If you haven't seen Kiss the Ground, it's unbelievable. What I really love about some of the new narrative is that more and more of this information is not just doom and gloom, but provides us some sort of a plausible path. Human beings will only alter their behavior for a very short period of time under fear. Fear is actually proven to not actually address long-term behavior changes. We have to provide hope. We have to provide some sort of a map of something that's plausible and a better life. And so one of the things that the environmental movement, I think, is starting to mature into is something that Jessica has said for a long time, which is no shame and blame. We've got to get to the point, start where you are. Start where you are. And I do believe that there's some extremes on both sides, that it's like, if somebody has taken one step, to Fiona, to what you said, if somebody is a small company and they've just taken a couple of steps, but they're basic, we should celebrate that. We should not just say that's not enough, and then we should do something about helping them.
Well, you talk about behavior and consumer behavior, at least in the short term, we have seen, and hopefully you'll agree with this, a quantum shift in traveler behavior, where instead of having 10 people go to a destination for one day, you have one person wanting to go to a destination for 10 days. And they want to do a more immersive experience. And it's an opportunity, whether it's a program that you are marketing through your travel advisors, Matthew, or James, that you're offering, or Brett's offering, to basically rearrange your itineraries, right, to allow for a deeper dive.
And the other thing I want to share that should be very pragmatic for anybody who's in travel right now, whether you're a destination or company, we're seeing, Virtuoso does not have a product. Our job is to shine a light on these incredible companies and organizations that do this stuff, so that those that are doing the best work are the most successful financially, and therefore it becomes a virtuous circle. But I also think that what's really powerful that we're seeing right now during the pandemic specific, we're starting to see a correlation between sustainability credibility and the customer's belief that they are safer, that they are going to take care of their health and wellness better because they are sustainably focused than those that are not.
Well, that brings up another point that I'd love you all to address. We've seen another shift. It started with WFH, and now it's WFA. Work from home, now work from anywhere. So you're seeing destinations that can promote social distancing. You're seeing destinations that can promote no over tourism, saying we're going to change our visa programs to allow you to come here and basically work for a year, and people are doing it. Now, they may be doing it because of fear. Let's not underestimate the worst four-letter word that starts with F when it comes to travel. But the point is, they are doing it. So what does that mean to you, Matthew, to James, to Brett, and of course to Fiona, in terms of how these shifts can actually lead to a better approach to sustainable tourism?
Well, we've obviously seen that a lot of this, we're nowhere near the sales we are. We're not completely locked down as Australia is. We have a great membership in Australia who is doing a lot of domestic, but there's no question that, the weekend getaway has become the month getaway, right? And villas and private or pods of families, after 9/11, we saw the rise of multi-generational travel. And now we're seeing multiple families literally taking over places, right? Taking over a small property or something, creating their own bubbles. So and what I think what that does actually feed is a deeper understanding of the destination, right? A more immersive experience, less haggard, little more intentional type travel.
James?
I think one of the things we're seeing, Peter, is people aren't necessarily asking me where to go in 2021, but more how to go in 2021. And I'm sure it's the same with our panelists as well. Where's the hot new destination? It's more how are you actually going to be traveling next year? And I think one of the things we're seeing in Intrepid is that people are going to want to get out into the wild more. People have been stuck at home. They have been cooped up at home. They want active experiences. They want wellness experiences. We find that we're thinking that people want to go deeper. And so I think to Matthew's point, they won't necessarily want to tick off getting to 15 spots in a 2-week holiday, but they might just want to really get immersed into a destination to support a local community. So we're seeing that people want to...
Is they've taken the traditional bucket list and thrown it out.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's too early to say, isn't it? But we are thinking that people won't be as obsessed with just going tick, 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 and they will be taking a more slower, more responsible approach. I think the other thing is that it's not necessarily about just traveling sustainably, but it's about traveling regeneratively. Yes. And how can actually their travel decisions make a material benefit and difference to the world, and particularly with millennials and Gen Z and their purchasing behavior, but also in older consumers too. Stuck at home, more time to research. They're wanting to make sure that they pick the right travel companies, so to book with Virtuoso or to use a travel corporation or Intrepid. So I think it will more be about how people will look to travel in 2021 than necessarily where people will travel, because some of the restrictions will still apply.
I tend to agree with you, James. It's not a matter of whether or where or if. It is about how. Brett, do you see that as well?
No. I think it's too early, Peter. Like anything in the world and in life, there's so many different opinions. As we saw with our recent election here, this country is divided almost exactly in two. Over the summer in Europe, you obviously saw people who didn't care about the virus, who behaved as if there was no virus in terms of the fly and flops that went to Spain, Portugal, and so forth. And as of this moment, Geneva's the hotspot in Europe where a lot of my family are. So, I think behavior over the summer taught us that some people have not changed at all. And I think we have to expect that, especially with the news yesterday that a vaccine is hopefully imminent. I don't think people have had long enough to truly change some of their behavior. We see it with garbage on the streets and so forth. It's no different to some of the demonstrations we saw last year on the streets of London with Extinction campaign and all the plastic water bottles that they threw on the streets all the time. So, I think there will be more people who want to travel sustainably, as I think was mentioned earlier by Matthew and James. The responsibility is on us as an industry to better educate the traveler on how they can travel sustainably. But I think there'll always be a percentage who don't care about it and just want to get on with their lives.
You mentioned the big C word that I'll come up with, and I'll throw it over to Matthew, and that's the word conversation. It's one of the things that you and I've talked about previously, Matthew, about the essential need for conversation, especially at moments like this, directly between your travel advisors and their clients, to be able to come up with some common ground, but at the same time to educate them in terms of what they're really getting into.
Yes, and actually that's such a great segue, because some great stuff has been said here, and I love that conversation, because I think that what's happening is, for example, what you just said, Brett, you're absolutely right, but it's because what it is that without a proper conversation, I don't really know what sustainable travel is. Right? In other words, there's still a lot of confusion around that word, right? There's still a lot of people that think it's like eco or somehow. And one of the things that has to happen in that conversation is you've got to have people that have a conversation that actually understand what is of value to the traveler, and actually connects the sustainable agenda to actually a travel experience that actually connects what's valuable to them, right? The authenticity, the local part, all those kinds of things. So I think that's really important. And what stresses a lot of people today, we live in a Google world where answers are a dime a dozen. What really is stressing people today is that I asked the right question. And I think that when we think about how to engage with consumers and people, for us, every single major disruption in the industry has always helped our profession, because it's actually imbued in the idea that I'd rather talk to somebody that has my back, right? That I can really have a conversation with, and that I can believe in, and has my best interest at hand, and has connections, right? Is connected to other people that I can work with.
You mentioned messaging and conversation. What different channels are you using, Fiona, to get that message out now you weren't using before?
Well, it's really interesting, actually, because I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, we are an international global NGO, and we work with travel partners to deliver to communities on the ground. And for me, the whole dialogue is about how do we create the best impact. And it's about, and for us to create the best impact, it is actually about operating with local communities at a local level, with local frameworks, giving local empowerment. But in the situation that we've got now with COVID and everybody being locked down, is how we use technology to also help us continue that support process, which can actually bring us closer in some ways with greater regularity. But then there's other aspects, like I said, some communities you cannot access. You have to get on motorbikes and go around with printed leaflets. So for me, it's about understanding the framework that we have to operate in, and then develop the best solutions, which is giving greater empowerment at a local level, but also at the same time using technology to support what we can to deliver that local support. And so it is horses for courses. And I think, the one thing we've all learned over this period of time is we have to be able to be extremely flexible, and no one solution fits all. So what works in one destination, and people are having that, booking holidays, trying to manage holiday, vacation programs. People are having to be flexible all the time, and we've not been any different.
I'd love to remind our audience that if you've got any questions for our panelists, please go on the chat line and send them in, and we'll do our best to answer them. And I know they're prepared to do that. I guess the question is, I look at the state of Hawaii, for example, as a very interesting example of how to recover. Very much like Australia, Hawaii is our only island state. So they operate as an island. They were supposed to reopen 4 different times. They finally did reopen, quote unquote, reopen October 15th, but it's still a slow go there. The communication really wasn't handled well. People didn't really know what they could or couldn't do. The local community has been impacted so much because Hawaii depends almost entirely on travel and tourism to drive their economy. So given those challenges, and I'll throw this open to you, Matthew, given those challenges, what would you recommend to the state of Hawaii in terms of maintaining those sustainable travel and tourism goals, and at the same time, reopening their economy?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see as a best practice today are communication and storytelling hubs that basically allow there to be accessibility by all kinds of different forms of sales and marketing and communication standards, short video conferencing, social media, visualization. These are all also very specific to all kinds of demographic and generational groups. So I think it's important nowadays as a destination or a product or whatever to be able to have kind of like, what is your core storyline? I think telling short, impactful stories has become one of the most important things that we can do. Human beings really actually are motivated by that. So I think that, and then the other things that we've been talking about at WTTC is that there needs to be a central, easily accessible, easily understood, simple, reliable, and extensible communication perspective from the government, right? In other words, it has to be, and has to have all those elements to it, because that's, the number one. We have so many clients that are ready to go right now. The thing that's stopping them is they don't want to be stuck, right? They don't want the rules of the game to change instantly. So I do also think that there's some sort of a protocol that needs to say, if something needs to be changed, there needs to be a protocol for visitors to figure out how they don't get frozen in time, right? How they don't get, and I think testing is a big part of that.
Well, let me expand, if I can, for a second on the definition of sustainable tourism and add the word financial sustainable tourism into it. Because, it's not necessarily what people are talking about, but it's what they're thinking about. And the two things that they're thinking about right now, it's trust. They don't trust the airlines because they couldn't get a refund when their flights were canceled. And they don't trust insurance companies because they found out after they bought the insurance that there was a clause on page 95 of their website that nobody ever saw that said, we don't cover you for pandemic. So if you want to get them back, how do you deal with those two issues?
Well, right now, for sure, flexibility of deposits and payments. I mean, this is an industry that is operated on float, and it's going to take 3 to 4. It's going to make 2 to 3 to 4 years for all that to kind of come back to some sort of normalcy. But I don't even know what that normalization really looks like. But for sure, in the short term, businesses and travel are going to have to be more flexible in their deposit terms and all those types of things to manage the risk that the customer feels that they have to have in order to do those things.
Got some questions coming in right now. Here's one for each of you. What are each of you doing as individuals and corporates to encourage naysayers?
To encourage
naysayers, the people who don't want, who just basically don't take this seriously.
Let's go.
Who wants to take that one? Brett?
I think I don't know if we're doing anything differently to try and encourage it. It's just Intrepid's been embedded in sustainable travel for 31 years, and I think we're trying to prove that sustainable travel isn't expensive. I think often there's a concept that, well, if I'm going to travel with a sustainable travel company, that means I'm going to pay 20% more than I would if I travel with an unsustainable travel company. And I think Intrepid, we try and talk a lot around that's not true, and that you can travel sustainably and travel very affordably in combination. You know, traveling in staying in local accommodation, trying the local food, using local restaurants, using different types of transport, that's not expensive per se. You know, I shouldn't reveal the secrets, but it isn't. And so I think we have to continue to promote the fact that sustainable travel doesn't mean expensive. I think we have to prove to some of the commercial success that organizations have. I think, again, there's often a perception out there that to be a good business or a commercially successful business, you have to be not doing good in the world. And, you know, you're an oil refinery, for example, and if you're doing good in the world, then you have to be an NGO. But actually, commercial business can do both. They can be commercially successful, and they can grow, and they can provide fantastic customer experience, but they can also make a real positive difference to the world. And I think, you know, the organizations on this line are doing that incredibly well. And that's something that we want to keep promoting and pushing through. The two are not, the two are actually in combination and don't have to fight each other.
Question for Fiona and for Brett. Do you agree that for the future of sustainable tourism, it is necessary to start in schools by making children aware, basically get down to education?
Absolutely.
I don't think anybody would argue with that. And actually, yeah, I remember about, it goes back about 15 years ago, there was this, the environment suddenly went on the agenda much more. I think it was when Branson was investigating biofuels and Al Gore, it might be more than 15 years ago, Al Gore brought out the inconceivable truth. And suddenly there was, you saw young kids in T-shirts with the planet and the environment, and messaging was going through schools. And I think one of the big challenges that we have with regards to this agenda, which really should sit in the DNA of every company, home, individual, you know, we've got to get it to the point where actually it just becomes a natural way of living, but it still sits in the space currently that if times get tough, it's the thing that drops off the agenda because it's seen that it requires further investment or further resource or further expertise. And actually we've got to be able to, and education is part of that, is we have to realize, and that's where I think, you know, Kiss the Ground, the cow conspiracy, you know, a lot of the programming that's coming out now is helping educate us all as individuals as well as businesses. And what we have to believe is that embracing it at whatever level we can is actually helping bring change. Change takes a long time. And, you know, we each can't do everything, but we can each do something. And if that starts educating in the schools about how we should be living our lives, whether it's how we travel, whether it's how we heat our homes, whether it's the food that we eat, which is another big area that needs to be considered, then if it does, it starts with education, Peter, and I'd say education.
Brett?
Totally agree. You look at Greta and her posts with over 10 million Instagram followers. I think she's done more to engage and encourage young people to speak up. I loved her tweet the other day to our president about chilling out and so forth. And I think, you know, we need to focus on leading sustainable lives, just like Fiona said. It's not just about traveling sustainably, it's about living sustainably. If we really want to address climate change and global warming, it is moving to a plant-based diet. When you see the science behind how much of our water supply goes to feeding cattle and how much of our arable land is dedicated to cattle, and it's just mind-boggling. And that's as or more important than traveling sustainably. And great to see McDonald's coming out with their McPlant burger I saw this morning. So, you know, it is about education. And I think it's about all of us opening up our hearts and our minds to sharing, as we talked on conversations. How can I share how I live sustainably, how I travel sustainably? We've committed, as have James and Intrepid, to sharing any of our learnings on how we're tracking our footprint and what we're doing to reduce it. And I know James has done the same with us. So it's an incredible industry that I think does care, but it's more about the traveler and the consumer. And it is telling stories. We put out some great videos this year as we funded every one of our TreadRight Foundation projects. And I just think we all need to do better in telling those stories and educating more people, be they young or of our age.
Right. We've talked about what we're telling travelers. What are the travelers telling you?
They want to get out. Some of them, as Matthew said, are very concerned about traveling carefully and safely. And we've all come up with great programs, protocols to do that. But a lot of them also are saying, we just want to get on with our lives. We don't care about the virus. And we want to do it affordably, but not necessarily sustainably, as I said earlier. So, with a global population of over 7 billion people, we're never going to get everyone thinking and acting the same way. But we can set an example. And I think the people on this panel are great examples of that. You too, Peter, with the stories and the conversations that you have with people like us and others. So thank you for what you do with your millions of listeners.
Thank you. But now let's get to the naming of this. This is a question that came in, and I throw this open to everybody, and please don't mince words. What kind of destinations in specific terms have the best perspective on the future of sustainable travel? We talked about dealing with governments. Now, which ones get it? Which ones don't? Yeah, take a shot. End your career. Go ahead.
I thought it was interesting. It was interesting pre-pandemic, wasn't it? When you saw, like Amsterdam, would talk about, typically as a tourism organisation, it's promoting more people to come to your destination. I thought it was interesting to see pre-pandemic that you saw a city like Amsterdam actually. The key KPIs that the tourism office was incentivized behind was not about getting more people to come, but it was about managing the experience for the people that visited, and managing the experience not just to have a great experience for the consumers who are coming into Amsterdam, but also for the local people too. And I think that's a very interesting, approach going forward, isn't it? We need to make sure that we have a great experience for our customers and have a wonderful time, but also that the experience doesn't negate the experience for people that live in a country or a city or a region. So I think we want to see more innovative ways to manage the return of tourism when it does happen.
Interestingly enough, one of the things that I noticed, which by the way happened before the pandemic, was Air France made a decision to tell their passengers that any destination they could get to by train, they would no longer fly.
Yeah, I think so. And I think Air France as well. I think we talk about the role of government working with private sector and the like. And I thought the French government came out and did a really excellent thing when they were helping bail out Air France earlier in the year. And they talked to that Air France had to reduce its emissions by 50% by 2025 to get the bailout money. They had to have targets based on carbon per passenger. And they had to start to work towards commitment towards biofuel usage over the course of the next 10 years. And I think that's a great example of the way in which governments can take a leadership position with the private sector. And ultimately, we're dealing with a pandemic that this generation and perhaps even generations before have never dealt with, and it's very, very challenging. But highlighting good examples of that, of where governments work together well, I think is what we need to keep doing.
Well, it's a crisis like this that takes away the competitive aspects and actually forces people to work together.
And I want
it does. I mean, but then on the other hand, we're doing it in a pre-environment anyway through WTTC. Like I said, last November we're together trying to work towards how we can start to share more information. But you're right, Peter. It does accentuate it for sure.
Yes, Matthew. I'm sorry.
No. And I absolutely correct. And I think my hesitancy in answering that question is not because I'm hesitant to end my career. I'm hesitant because the reality, it's more complicated than that, because I don't want to name a destination where there's a nascent group of people that are doing the right thing. And I mentioned something about a destination that's not so good, right? And all of a sudden, and one of the problems with society is this kind of like, everything is binary. It's this or it's that. It's this or it's that. And it's like, it's way more nuanced than that. So I do think that what James said, though, is really
let me rephrase the question.
Yeah.
Who should be doing a better job?
Well, I think, look, here's, you
We can
talk
all
about
do
career-ending things. I'll do this for you, Peter, because I've never said this before. But when the first time I was asked to put on a panel about over-tourism, I mean, dealing with that subject was like dealing with some of the most intractable potential things. It's like, what can I possibly say about over-tourism that I'm really gonna, and when it finally came down to me, it was like, you know what? We're the visitors. Where over-tourism or now under-tourism or conscious comeback needs to reside is in the will of the people. It's about self-determination. It's about what the people of a place need to do. The problem that we have in a lot of cases is that there are good laws, there's good structure, but the one thing that's the enemy of all this is entrenched interests and corruption. That in the end can be the thing that will, so I'm not going to name names, but there are places there where there have been environmental emergencies where the reality is the laws were all there, but the skirting of the laws, to put it differently, was rampant, and people pay the price.
I've seen that happen on a global level, Matthew. I saw it happen in Thailand where the law said, you know, any hotel unit over 50 rooms had to provide for black water, for gray water, for employee housing. And so you saw these massive 500 room resorts in which they were violating the law because they had sold off ownership in 49 unit parcels. And they were under the 50 units. And that's just unconscionable.
Well, and again, this is why self-determination is so important. Fiona, you probably know more about it than.
No, I think there's a different way of approaching it in a sense, Peter, and in terms of, you know, we can all do better.
Yeah.
But there are a number of destinations that actually have really embraced sustainability well. We need to get the message out that it is all of our individual, corporate, collective, governmental responsibilities. This is on the agenda permanently, unless we want to wipe ourselves out, not in our lifetimes, but somebody else's lifetime. So this agenda is here to stay. And there are some fantastic examples across the world. And those need to be showcased and shared and communicated as effectively and more effectively than we're already doing. And we need to create a sort of residue demand to share that insight and, you know, the stuff that James and Brett are doing, and being prepared to share that insight and that knowledge. Because the thing that holds us all back is lots of people think, well, where do we start? Well, actually, there's somebody out there that's already done it. So having the means to access that kind of insight and information and finding a framework to do that would help a lot of our problems. And it might be something WTTC might like to tackle.
I'll take that as a less than subtle hint. We're almost out of time. I do want to thank, of course, Karen Hoffman again from the Bradford Group for putting this together again for our 23rd annual awards ceremony. We've just been awarded by you guys, so thank you. And of course, to the New York Times, to the Travel Corporation, to Reed Exhibitions, and of course, United Airlines for once again being our sponsor. I think I can speak for all of our panelists when I say we look forward to seeing you all in person next year in London, and I'll hold you to that. So to James, to Brett, to Matthew, and to Fiona, thank you for joining me. And to all of you, thank you for participating in this session. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Bye, Fiona.